He is an orthopedic surgeon. He's the former team doctor for the Chargers. He is the man behind Sports Injury Central. And he appears weekly on our podcast, Jim Rome's Big Head Bets. He has a perspective and an insight that I want. My fingers are crossed. And I want to take one more shot at this. We've tried numerous telephone lines. We go back to it right now. Doc, my fingers are crossed. Are you there?
I am, Jim. And let me say one thing. I am so thankful it was just, whether it was my phone or your phone that went haywire, I'm so thankful that the emergency action protocol by the NFL, by the Bengals home team staff, and the Bills went like clockwork smooth last night. And that literally was the thing that may have, and hopefully, I'm hopeful, that has saved his life.
Doc, I see what you just did there. You want to make sure you get that point in before we got cut off once again. So far, so good. Why don't you, since we're still good, maybe elaborate on that? What was the protocol? Exactly what happened in those moments, and why were you so impressed with what you saw?
I'm impressed because, every team drills this in the preseason, and we all think we're not going to need it. I mean, in my career in the NFL, we never did this. Well, there was one occasion where there was a guy who went down, a member of the chain gang on the sideline, and the game was stopped for 10, 15 minutes, and there was some cardiac life support to the chain gang member, but never to a healthy player on the field like that. And everyone sprung into action very, very appropriately and quickly. A lot of people, and sometimes deservedly, criticize the NFL related to the concussion protocol. But I think those same people need to give kudos here. The Bengals, the home team, acted very, very quickly. The trauma center's on standby, the paramedics. There's a meeting before the game, 90 minutes before, of all the doctors and emergency personnel to go over any last-minute details. And it just worked very well. And this is what gives us hope. And before we got cut off, I was talking about how emotional it was for me, because as a parent to see that, and I'm thankful my wife got the kids out of the room. I can't imagine how emotional it was for viewers and some of your listeners, which is why I decided to do some of the appearances to sort of give people some hope, some perspective, some framework without speculating. But right now, I'm very, very cautiously optimistic that there's going to be a good outcome here. Why? Because his heart was restarted on the field. They got to him within seconds and maintained with CPR, blood flow to the brain. He apparently has vital signs. Yes, he's still critical. Yes, he still has a breathing tube, but those are, quote, normal things when you're in an ICU setting. So I'm cautiously optimistic, and, I hope that my mind isn't playing tricks on me, trying to look at the sunny side and trying to speak things into existence. But I'm very hopeful that this young man will be okay. And another great sign even last night, I thought, besides everyone doing their job very well, was the fact that it was well reported that the ambulance waited in the tunnel for the mom. If you're unstable or actively continuing CPR, you're not waiting for the mom. And so I just hung on to that hope. And with the Bills report, it seems to be coming true, but there's still more steps to come. And it was a scary situation that I've never personally encountered, but I wanted to, express some of that to as many people as possible, because I think it was very, very disturbing.
Extremely well said, Doc. I'm so glad that we battled through that to have this conversation. Dr. David Chao is an orthopedic surgeon. He's a former team doctor for the Chargers. He is also the man behind Sports Injury Central, where they are covering this. Doc, can you explain, it seemed like a routine play. In fact, it was a routine play. Medically speaking, exactly what happened to Damar Hamlin?
Well, it was clearly cardiac in nature because he got up. It wasn't his head. But when you get up, if your heart isn't beating correctly and delivering blood, there is no blood flow to your brain. In a few seconds, and it was like 3-4 seconds, he collapsed, and they started CPR. Look, I don't want to speculate on the injury specifics, but there is something called commotio cordis. It's not very common, where you can get hit in a very unlucky spot in the chest at the exact right part of the EKG wave status, and it makes your electrical system, your heart, go haywire. That could have been the cause of it. Of course, they'll look at any underlying cause and anything else, but super scary. And, the fact that they restarted the heart pretty quickly, I think it just bodes very well. Look, last night in game, I was saying, I hope to God that they continue to play this game, because I felt like the only way they could continue to play this game if they knew that he was okay. And if they didn't know he was okay, there's no way they could finish that game. And this situation, Jim, is much different than what we saw, let's say, with Josh Sweat over the weekend in the Eagles when he was spine boarded off. That's scary. But you know what? Players have seen that before, and they've walked away often, and you usually get a thumbs up. Like the Ryan Shazier situation in that same stadium years ago was scary. But this one was just different. I bet very few, if any of your listeners, have ever personally witnessed CPR and a defibrillator on a live person, much less a friend and a teammate. I mean, that is just so horrific of a visual, and I'm glad that they didn't show it on TV. And that's why I was emotional, and the players were emotional. And look, prayers out, and let's keep speaking this optimism into existence. I'm very hopeful, and I've never wanted to be more right about analysis in my life.
Talking to Dr. David Chao, an orthopedic surgeon and former team doctor for the Chargers, also the man behind Sports Injury Central. Doc, I think you echoed something I said earlier, that I understand that there are inherent risks in this game. The players know this. It's a dangerous game. They know what they sign up for. But this, in fact, is different. This is very different. The point that you just made, that if the listeners have never, ever seen CPR administered or a defibrillator used in a situation like that, I mean, it really is a terrifying thing, right? Is this not part of the reason why the players were so upset around him?
It's terrifying for anybody. And look, I didn't like the looks of it. Look, I'm not a heart expert. I'm an orthopedist. I was a head team physician. But the other point I want to make out to viewers here is, kudos to the NFL with the protocol. But there's no, other than if you're actually in a hospital when you collapse and have a heart attack. And even then, it has to be witnessed, right? But there's no better place for that to happen, not that you ever want it to happen, than an NFL football field. Because there are over 24 medical personnel, emergency personnel, trauma physicians, the cardiac cart, 2 defibrillators, the paramedics, the drilling ahead of time, the meeting before the game, the drilling preseason, et cetera, that every team undergoes. There's no, quote, safer place to have a heart attack than on an NFL field. Remember a few years ago, Jim, Gary Kubiak, as he walked off the field at halftime for the Texans as the head coach, collapsed. And I said that then, and thankfully he was saved as well. And so let's hope so far that everything goes smoothly, and we can continue to say that the Bengals and Bills personnel and the field personnel, medical personnel, saved this young man's life. And that's what we're hopeful for. But that's why all these precautions are there for a just-in-case situation.
Right. You hope you never need to use them, but just in case. Doc, a thought before you go. When he was given a breathing tube, was that necessarily bad news, or was that a bad sign?
Well, in general, it's never good when you're 24 and you have a breathing tube, period, end of discussion. But the NFL personnel on the field have the ability not only for a breathing tube, but even to do what's called a tracheostomy, to cut into his airway for emergency purposes. They didn't need to do that. But it is relatively, quote, routine and normal to have a breathing tube, to be sure your breathing is controlled if you're in a critical care situation and in the ICU. So the next hope is that later today, or more likely tomorrow morning, we get word that the breathing tube is removed. The breathing tube in and of itself is not necessarily worse news given the cardiac arrest situation.
All right, so Doc, do this. Next time you and I speak, we'll be talking about the matchups. But we're not doing that right now, and I'd rather not get into that right now. But what I do want you to do, if you don't mind, can you direct our listeners and our viewers to Sports Injury Central? Because as I mentioned, you said it yourself, you weren't sure whether or not you wanted to do it last night, but I was watching you and monitoring you, and you did provide video and analysis last night during this episode. Where should they go to get more information as you continue to track this story yourself?
Well, we hope good news comes, but as any news comes, we'll provide the analysis at sicscore.com, Sports Injury Central. Our goal there is to be responsible analysts in this world, not speculating on injuries, but giving people insight and comfort, especially in this very, very scary, frightening case, in a very respectful way without going overboard, providing some background and framework based on the time that we've had in the NFL, et cetera, to try and explain things to fans. And we'll continue to do so on sicscore.com. And one of the things like fans I think were clamoring about last night too, and I've heard, Jim, is why was the ambulance so slow? Why didn't they just load them in and go? Well, the reason why is that you can't transport an unstable patient. You're safer on the field with the 24 medical personnel and all the equipment than you are in an ambulance with 3 people. So the rule of thumb is you stabilize before you transport. You don't just load them and go when the patient is unstable. So that wasn't anything that the people on the field did wrong. That was normal protocol. So we try and explain these things to people to make them feel better in a very frightening situation.
So I'm glad you made that point, Doc. And also I'm glad that this is why I battled to finish the conversation. That was well worth the time, Doc. I appreciate you staying in that battle with us. Thank you very much. I appreciate the insight and the perspective, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Dr. David Chao. You can follow him at ProFootballDoc.